Hello, horror lovers. Welcome to the channel. Before the terror begins, I want to ask you to subscribe to the channel, as it will help me a lot. Also, leave a comment telling me which city you're watching from. I'd love to know. Click the like button. All of this because the crisp autumn air filled my lungs as I stepped onto the well-worn trail of redwood forest. Fallen leaves crunched beneath my boots, their earthy scent rising with each step. I adjusted my backpack, feeling the familiar weight of my water bottle and trail mix settle against my spine. Just a quick hike, I muttered to myself, glancing at my watch. Be back before dinner, Clara. You promised, Mom. The forest stretched before me, ancient redwoods reaching towards the sky, their branches filtering the late afternoon sunlight into a dappled pattern on the forest floor. I'd walked this trail countless times, but today felt different. An unusual stillness hung in the air, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. I shook off the feeling, chalking it up to too many late-night thriller novels. Get a grip, Clara, I chided myself, forcing a laugh that sounded hollow even to my own ears. As I rounded a bend in the trail, a twig snapped loudly underfoot. I jumped, my heart racing for a moment before I realized it was just me. But the sound seemed to echo unnaturally, and I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was watching me. I paused, scanning the trees around me. "Hello?" I called out, immediately feeling foolish. "Is anyone there?" Only the whisper of wind through the leaves answered me. I took a deep breath, trying to calm my nerves. "You're being ridiculous," I told myself firmly. "It's broad daylight and this trail is perfectly safe." Despite my self-assurances, I picked up my pace, wanting to reach the scenic overlook that marked the halfway point of my hike. The faster I went, the sooner I could turn back and be home safe and sound. The trail narrowed, winding between two massive redwoods. As I squeezed through, the wind shifted, carrying a sound that made my blood run cold. A cry, faint but unmistakable, drifted through the trees. I froze, straining my ears. Had I imagined it? But no, there it was again, a muffled sound that could only be a human voice, filled with fear and pain. "Hello?" I called out again, louder this time. "Is someone there? Do you need help?" Silence fell once more, heavy and oppressive. I stood at a crossroads, my heart pounding. The sensible part of my brain screamed at me to turn back, to run down the trail and alert the park rangers. But a stronger instinct, one I couldn't ignore, urged me to investigate. "What if someone's hurt?" I whispered, already knowing I'd made my decision. "I can't just leave them." Taking a deep breath, I stepped off the marked trail, pushing through the underbrush in the direction I thought the cry had come from. Branches scratched at my arms and I stumbled over hidden roots, but I pressed on. "Hello?" I called every few steps. "Where are you? Can you hear me?" The forest seemed to close in around me, the towering redwoods now ominous sentinels rather than majestic giants. I lost all sense of time and direction, guided only by the occasional faint cry that spurred me onward. Just as I was about to give up and try to find my way back to the trail, I broke through a dense patch of ferns and stumbled into a small clearing. What I saw there turned my blood to ice. A figure was slumped against a massive redwood, their wrists and ankles bound tightly to the trunk with rope. Their head hung forward, obscuring their face, but I could see the rise and fall of labored breathing. "Oh my God!" I gasped, rushing forward. "Are you okay? What happened?" As I neared, the person's head snapped up, revealing a face bruised and bloody. Their eyes locked onto mine, wide with a mixture of hope and terror. "Help me," they croaked, their voice barely above a whisper. "Please. He'll come back." My trembling hands reached for the ropes, fumbling with the tight knots. "It's okay," I said, trying to keep my voice calm despite the panic rising in my chest. "I'm going to get you out of here. What's your name?" "Alex," they managed, wincing as I worked on the bindings. He took me. Days ago. Thought I was going to die here." "You're safe now, Alex," I assured them, though a nagging voice in the back of my mind warned me that we were far from safe. "I'm Clara. As soon as I get you free, we'll get out of here and find help." The rope was unyielding, clearly tied by someone who knew what they were doing. I reached into my pocket for my Swiss Army knife, silently thanking my dad for insisting I always carry it. Just as I was about to start sawing at the ropes, a twig snapped behind me. Alex's eyes widened in horror, looking past me into the forest. "Run," they whispered urgently. "Run!" I whirled around, my heart stopping as I came face to face with a masked figure emerging from the shadows, a wicked-looking knife glinting in their hand. "Well, well," a cold voice drawled from behind the mask. "Looks like I've caught another one. How convenient." The knife rose, and I knew in that moment that my life would never be the same. The peaceful hike had turned into a nightmare, and I was now trapped in a deadly game of cat and mouse in the very forest I once called home. My heart pounded in my chest as I approached the battered figure tied to the tree. Each step felt like an eternity, the forest around us eerily silent save for the victim's labored breathing. "It's okay," I said softly, trying to keep my voice steady. "I'm here to help you. Can you tell me your name?" The person's head lifted slowly, revealing a face marred with cuts and bruises. Their eyes, filled with a mix of hope and fear, locked onto mine. "Sarah," she croaked, her voice barely above a whisper. "My name is Sarah. Please help me." I knelt beside her, my hands shaking as I examined the ropes binding her to the tree. They were tied tightly, cutting into her wrists and ankles. "I'm Clara," I told her, fumbling with the knots. "I'm going to get you out of here, Sarah. Can you tell me what happened?" Sarah's eyes darted nervously around the clearing. He took me. I was jogging on the trail and he came out of nowhere. I've been here for, I don't know how long. Days, maybe." A chill ran down my spine. "He? Who's he, Sarah?" Before she could answer, a twig snapped somewhere behind me. We both froze, terror coursing through my veins. "He's coming back," Sarah whimpered, her eyes wide with panic. "Please, you have to hurry." My fingers worked faster, desperately trying to loosen the knots. "It's okay. I've almost got it," I lied, more to reassure myself than Sarah. The ropes were expertly tied, and I was making little progress. Another snap, closer this time. I spun around, scanning the trees for any sign of movement. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. "Is someone there?" Silence answered me, but I could feel a presence watching us. I turned back to Sarah, redoubling my efforts on the ropes. "I can't get these undone," I said, frustration and fear making my voice crack. "I have a pocket knife in my bag. If I can just—" "Behind you!" Sarah screamed suddenly. I whirled around to find myself face to face with a masked figure, their knife glinting in the fading sunlight. Time seemed to stand still as I stared into the cold eyes visible through the mask's eye holes. "Well, well," a deep voice rumbled from behind the mask. "What do we have here? A little hero come to save the day?" I stumbled backward, my back pressing against the tree where Sarah was tied. "Please," I stammered. "We don't want any trouble. Just let us go." The masked man chuckled, a sound devoid of any warmth. "Let you go? Oh no, my dear. The fun is just beginning." He took a step forward, and I instinctively moved to shield Sarah with my body. "Don't come any closer," I shouted, trying to sound braver than I felt. "Clara, run!" Sarah pleaded behind me. "Save yourself." But I couldn't move. Fear had rooted me to the spot, my mind racing with possible escape plans, each one more desperate than the last. The killer tilted his head, studying me. "You're a brave one, aren't you? Most would have run by now. I do so enjoy a challenge." He lunged forward suddenly, the knife slashing through the air. I dodged to the side, feeling the blade whistle past my ear. Adrenaline surged through me, breaking the paralysis of fear. I sprinted towards the trees, my feet pounding against the forest floor. Behind me, I could hear Sarah screaming and the heavy footsteps of the killer in pursuit. "You can't escape." His voice boomed through the forest. "I know these woods better than anyone." Branches whipped at my face as I ran blindly. my only thought to put as much distance between myself and the killer as possible. I could hear him crashing through the underbrush behind me, steadily gaining ground. My foot caught on a root, sending me sprawling to the ground. I scrambled to get up, but a heavy weight landed on my back, pinning me down. "Got you!" The killer growled in my ear, his breath hot against my skin. I thrashed wildly, managing to flip onto my back. The killer straddled me, his knife raised high. "Any last words, little hero?" he asked, a hint of amusement in his voice. In that moment, survival instinct took over. My hand closed around a fallen branch, and I swung it with all my might. It connected with the side of the killer's head with a sickening crack. He reeled backward, stunned by the blow. I didn't waste a second, scrambling to my feet and running once more into the depths of the forest. "You'll pay for that!" I heard him roar behind me, his voice filled with rage. Tears streamed down my face as I ran, the realization of what I'd just done and what I'd left behind hitting me all at once. Sarah was still tied to that tree, at the mercy of a madman, and now I too was being hunted. The chase had begun, and as darkness started to fall over the redwood forest, I knew that my chances of survival were growing slimmer by the minute. The once peaceful woods had become a nightmarish labyrinth, and somewhere in its depths, a killer was coming for me. Time stood still as I stared into the cold eyes of the killer, his mask hiding all but the murderous intent gleaming in his gaze. My heart pounded so loudly I was sure he could hear it, matching the rhythm of my ragged breaths. "Nowhere to run now, little dear," he taunted, his voice a low growl that sent shivers down my spine. "Why don't you make this easy on both of us and just give up?" I swallowed hard, my mind racing. "Why are you doing this?" I managed to croak out, desperately trying to buy time. "Please, just let me go. I won't tell anyone, I swear." The killer chuckled, a sound devoid of any warmth. "Oh, they all say that. But you and I both know that's not true, don't we?" He took a step forward, and I instinctively backed away, my eyes never leaving the glinting blade in his hand. "Stay back," I shouted, my voice stronger than I felt. "I'm warning you." "Warning me?" He laughed. "And what exactly do you think you can do?" In that moment, survival instinct took over. As he lunged forward, I ducked, feeling the whistle of the knife as it passed inches from my face. Without thinking, I charged forward, ramming my shoulder into his midsection. The impact knocked us both off balance, sending us tumbling to the forest floor. I scrambled to my feet, not daring to look back as I took off running deeper into the woods. "You can run, but you can't hide," his enraged voice boomed behind me. "I know these woods better than you ever will." Branches whipped at my face as I ran, my feet pounding against the uneven ground. Every shadow seemed to hide another threat, every rustle of leaves a potential attacker. But I couldn't stop. Stopping meant death. I could hear him crashing through the underbrush behind me, steadily gaining ground. My lungs burned and my legs felt like lead, but terror propelled me forward. "Think, Clara, think," I gasped to myself. "You can't outrun him forever." A fallen tree loomed ahead, its massive trunk creating a natural barrier. In a split-second decision, I veered towards it, diving into the hollow space beneath. I pressed myself as far back as I could, trying to quiet my labored breathing. Footsteps approached, slow and deliberate. I held my breath, praying that the growing darkness would hide me from view. Come out wherever you are," the killer called, his voice unnervingly close. "You're only making this harder on yourself." I watched through a small gap as his boots passed by my hiding spot, leaves crunching under each step. He paused for a moment and I was sure he had spotted me, but then he moved on, his footsteps fading into the distance. I waited, counting to 100 in my head before daring to move. Slowly, painfully, I crawled out from under the log, every muscle in my body protesting. "Okay, Clara," I whispered to myself. "You've bought some time. Now what?" The forest had grown dark, the towering redwoods blocking out what little daylight remained. I strained my eyes, trying to get my bearings. Which way was the trail? Which way was out? A twig snapped somewhere to my left and I froze. I can smell your fear. The killer's voice drifted through the trees. It's intoxicating. Panic threatened to overwhelm me, but I forced it down. I couldn't let fear paralyze me now. Spotting a sturdy-looking branch on the ground, I snatched it up, gripping it tightly. If he wants a fight, I muttered, I'll give him one. I started moving again, trying to step as quietly as possible. Every sound seemed amplified in the eerie silence of the forest. The rustle of leaves, the hoot of a distant owl, the pounding of my own heart. Suddenly, a hand clamped down on my shoulder. I whirled around, swinging the branch with all my might. It connected with something solid, and I heard a grunt of pain. You little bitch, the killer snarled, stumbling back. I didn't wait to see if I'd done any real damage. I ran again, my makeshift weapon still clutched in my hand. The forest seemed to close in around me, branches reaching out like grasping fingers trying to slow me down. You can't escape. His voice echoed through the trees. This is my domain. I risked a glance over my shoulder and immediately regretted it. He was closer than I thought, his mask gleaming in a stray shaft of moonlight. The momentary distraction cost me dearly as my foot caught on an exposed root. I tumbled to the ground, the impact knocking the wind out of me. The branch flew from my grasp, disappearing into the underbrush. I tried to get up, but a searing pain in my ankle told me I had twisted it in the fall. No, 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 I whimpered, dragging myself forward. Heavy footsteps approached from behind, slow and deliberate. I could hear the killer's labored breathing, a mixture of exertion and excitement. End of the line, little dear, he said, standing over me. I must say you've given me quite the chase, but now it's time to end our little game. I rolled onto my back, looking up at the masked face of my tormentor. The knife glinted in his hand, raised and ready to strike. In that moment, facing what I was sure would be my death, something snapped inside me. A primal scream tore from my throat as I kicked out with my good leg, catching him off guard and knocking him back. Ignoring the pain, I scrambled to my feet and limped as fast as I could towards a dense thicket of ferns. If I could just make it there, maybe I could lose him in the undergrowth. As I pushed through the ferns, I caught sight of something that made my heart leap, a faint glow in the distance. Civilization, safety. If I could just reach it. With renewed determination, I pressed on, the killer's enraged shouts fading behind me. The chase wasn't over, but for the first time since this nightmare began, I felt a glimmer of hope. Somehow, someway, I was going to survive this night in the redwood forest. The branch connected with a sickening thud, and I didn't wait to see its effect. Adrenaline surged through my veins as I dashed deeper into the woods, the killer's pained grunt fading behind me. The forest, once a place of solace, had become a dark labyrinth of terrors. You can't run forever, his voice boomed, echoing through the trees. I know these woods like the back of my hand. I pushed myself harder, ignoring the burning in my lungs and the sting of branches whipping across my face. The faint glow I'd spotted earlier had disappeared, leaving me disoriented in the pitch-black forest. Think, Clara. Think. I gasped to myself between ragged breaths. You need a plan. As if in answer, the ground suddenly dropped away beneath my feet. I tumbled down a steep embankment, leaves and twigs scratching at my skin. When I finally came to a stop, I found myself in a small ravine, hidden from view by dense undergrowth. For a moment, I lay there, trying to catch my breath and fighting the urge to sob. The reality of my situation crashed over me like a tidal wave. Mom, Dad, I whispered into the darkness. I'm so sorry. I should have listened to you about hiking alone. The sound of heavy footsteps above snapped me back to reality. I held my breath, pressing myself flat against the damp earth. Where are you, little dear? The killer called out, his voice unnervingly close. Come out wherever you are. I could see the beam of a flashlight sweeping across the forest floor above me. My heart pounded so loudly I was sure he would hear it. But after what felt like an eternity, the light moved on, and the footsteps faded into the distance. Slowly, painfully, I pulled myself to my feet. Every muscle in my body screamed in protest, and I could feel warm blood trickling from various cuts and scrapes. But I was alive, and for now, that was all that mattered. "Okay, Clara," I muttered to myself, taking stock of my surroundings. "You can do this. You just need to find a way out of these woods." The ravine seemed to stretch on in both directions, offering some cover from my pursuer. I chose a direction at random and started moving, keeping low and trying to step as quietly as possible. As I walked, my mind raced with questions. Who was this killer? Why was he doing this? And what about Sarah, the woman I'd found tied to the tree? Was she still alive? The guilt of leaving her behind gnawed at me, but I pushed it aside. I couldn't help her if I was dead. After what felt like hours of creeping through the darkness, I spotted something that made my heart leap. A hollow tree, its trunk wide enough to hide in. It wasn't much, but it was the closest thing to shelter I'd seen all night. I squeezed inside, the musty smell of decaying wood filling my nostrils. It was a tight fit, but I managed to curl up, making myself as small as possible. For the first time since this nightmare began, I allowed myself a moment to breathe. What am I going to do? I whispered to myself, tears finally spilling down my cheeks. I can't keep running forever. As if in answer, a memory surfaced. A survival show I'd watched months ago. The host had talked about the importance of staying put if you're lost in the woods, making it easier for rescuers to find you. But could I risk staying in one place with a killer on the loose? And would anyone even be looking for me? I hadn't told anyone about my hike today. A sudden rustle outside made me freeze. I held my breath, straining my ears for any sign of the killer. "I know you're close." His voice drifted through the night air, sending chills down my spine. "I can practically taste your fear." I clamped a hand over my mouth to stifle a whimper. He was so close. If he found me here, I'd be trapped. "You're different from the others, you know," he continued, his voice taking on an almost conversational tone. "Most of them just cry and beg, but you're a fighter. I respect that." His words made my skin crawl. How many others had there been? How many lives had this monster taken? "It's almost a shame to kill you," he mused. "But then again, the thrill of the hunt. There's nothing quite like it." I squeezed my eyes shut, willing him to move on. Each second felt like an eternity, the silence broken only by the pounding of my heart and the killer's slow, deliberate footsteps. Finally, mercifully, the footsteps began to fade. I waited, counting to 100 in my head before daring to peek out of my hiding spot. The forest was quiet, save for the normal sounds of nocturnal wildlife. For now, at least, I was alone. I slumped back against the inside of the tree, exhaustion threatening to overwhelm me. But I couldn't sleep, not here, not now. I needed to stay alert, to be ready to run at a moment's notice. As the first hints of dawn began to lighten the sky, I made a decision. I couldn't stay in this tree forever. I needed to find my way out of these woods, to get help not just for myself, but for Sarah and any other victims who might still be alive. With trembling legs, I crawled out of my sanctuary. The forest looked different in the pale pre-dawn light, less menacing but no less dangerous. I knew the killer was still out there waiting, but as I took my first tentative steps towards what I hoped was civilization, I felt a spark of determination ignite within me. I was going to survive this nightmare no matter what it took. And someday, somehow, I was going to make sure this killer faced justice for what he'd done. With that thought steeling my resolve, I began the long, perilous journey out of the redwood forest, every sense on high alert for the monster who still hunted me. The fluorescent lights of the police station buzzed overhead, their harsh glare a stark contrast to the shadowy forest I had just escaped. My clothes were torn and muddy, my skin covered in scratches and bruises. I sat in an uncomfortable plastic chair, clutching a paper cup of lukewarm coffee, trying to stop my hands from shaking. Detective Sarah Morales sat across from me, her dark eyes studying my face as I recounted my harrowing tale for what felt like the 100th time. "So, let me get this straight, Miss Hamilton," Detective Morales said, her pen poised over her notepad. "You were hiking in Redwood Forest when you heard cries for help. You found a woman tied to a tree, and then you were attacked by a masked man with a knife?" I nodded, my throat tight. "Yes, that's right. Her name was Sarah. She said she'd been there for days. We have to find her. She could still be out there." Detective Morales exchanged a glance with her partner, Detective Johnson, who was leaning against the wall with his arms crossed. I didn't miss the skepticism in their eyes. "Miss Hamilton," Detective Johnson said, his voice gentle but doubting, "we've had patrol cars searching the area you described all night. They haven't found any evidence of a woman tied to a tree or any signs of a struggle." I felt a surge of frustration. "But I'm telling you, she was there, and the killer, he chased me through the woods for hours. How could there not be any evidence?" Detective Morales leaned forward, her expression softening slightly. "Clara, I understand you've been through a traumatic experience, but are you sure you didn't imagine some of this? Perhaps you fell and hit your head during your hike?" "What? No!" I exclaimed, standing up so quickly that my coffee spilled. "I know what I saw, what I experienced. Why don't you believe me?" "Please calm down," Detective Johnson said, stepping forward. "We're not saying we don't believe you. We just need to consider all possibilities." I sank back into my chair, tears of frustration welling in my eyes. "You think I'm crazy, don't you? That I made this all up?" Detective Morales sighed. "No one's saying that, Clara. But you have to admit, it's a pretty incredible story. And without any physical evidence?" "What about my injuries?" I demanded, holding out my scratched arms. "The torn clothes? How do you explain that?" "You said yourself you fell several times while running through the woods," Detective Johnson pointed out. "That could account for the injuries and the state of your clothes." I buried my face in my hands, feeling utterly helpless. How could I make them understand the terror I'd experienced, the very real danger I'd faced? "Look," Detective Morales said after a moment, "why don't we all take a break? You've been through a lot, Clara. Get some rest, and we'll head out to the forest at first light. Maybe seeing the area in person will help jog your memory or uncover some evidence we missed." I nodded numbly, too exhausted to argue further. As the detectives left the room, I overheard a snippet of their conversation. "What do you think, Sarah?" Detective Johnson murmured. "I don't know, Mike," Detective Morales replied. "Her story seems far-fetched, but she genuinely believes it. Maybe there's more to this than we're seeing." Their voices faded as they walked away, leaving me alone with my thoughts and the lingering fear that the killer was still out there, waiting. The next morning, bleary-eyed from a sleepless night, I found myself back in Redwood Forest. The beauty of the towering trees in the morning light seemed almost obscene after the horrors I'd experienced here. "Okay, Clara," Detective Morales said as we stepped onto the trail. "Lead the way. Show us where you first heard the cries for help." I nodded, trying to orient myself. Everything looked different in the daylight, and my memories of that night were a blur of terror and adrenaline. But slowly, I began to recognize landmarks. "It was around here," I said, stepping off the main trail. "I heard the voice coming from this direction." We pushed through the underbrush, the detective scanning the ground for any signs of disturbance. My heart raced as we approached the clearing where I'd found Sarah. But when we broke through the trees, my blood ran cold. The clearing was empty. There was no sign of Sarah, no ropes on the tree where she'd been tied, not even any trampled vegetation to suggest there had been a struggle. I don't understand," I stammered, spinning in a circle. "She was right here. The tree. It was this one. I'm sure of it." Detective Johnson examined the trunk of the tree closely. "There's no marks on the bark, no signs that ropes were tied here recently." "That's impossible," I insisted, my voice rising in panic. "I know what I saw. Detective Morales placed a hand on my shoulder. Clara, I know this is difficult, but... No, I shouted, shrugging off her hand. I'm not crazy. Sarah was here, the killer was here, why would I make this up? As the detectives exchanged worried glances, a glint of something in the underbrush caught my eye. I rushed over, pushing aside the ferns to reveal a small, metallic object. Look, I cried, pointing. What's that? Detective Johnson crouched down, pulling on a latex glove before carefully picking up the object. He held it up to the light, his eyebrows furrowing. It's a button, he said slowly. Looks like it's from a police uniform. A chill ran down my spine as I remembered the killer's words. I know these woods better than anyone. Could it be? Was the killer one of their own? As I looked at the detectives' shocked faces, I realized that this nightmare was far from over. In fact, it might be just beginning. The days following my terrifying ordeal in Redwood Forest blurred together in a haze of sleepless nights and paranoid days. Every shadow seemed to hide a threat. Every unexpected sound sent my heart racing. The safe haven of my apartment had become a prison of fear. I sat on my couch, wrapped in a blanket despite the warm weather, staring blankly at the TV. The news anchor's voice droned on, barely registering until a familiar name caught my attention. Still no leads in the disappearance of local hiker Sarah Mitchell. The 28-year-old was last seen entering Redwood Forest 5 days ago. I bolted upright, my eyes glued to the screen. A photo of a smiling woman with curly brown hair filled the screen. The same woman I had found tied to a tree. The woman the police claimed didn't exist. Sarah, I whispered, my hand reaching out to touch the TV screen. I knew I didn't imagine you. A knock at the door made me jump, a scream catching in my throat. I muted the TV, my heart pounding as I approached the door cautiously. Who is it? I called out, my voice shaking. Clara, it's Lisa, can I come in? I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. Lisa was my best friend, one of the few people I'd allowed to visit since my incident in the forest. I unlocked the door, opening it just enough to peer out. Lisa stood in the hallway, concern etched on her face. Hey, you okay? You look like you've seen a ghost. I stepped back, allowing her to enter. I'm fine, just a little jumpy. Lisa walked in, her eyes scanning the dimly lit apartment. Empty takeout containers and unwashed dishes cluttered the coffee table, and the curtains were drawn tight against the afternoon sun. Clara, Lisa said softly, turning to face me. This isn't healthy. You can't keep living like this. I sank back onto the couch, pulling the blanket around me. You don't understand, Lisa. He's still out there. What if he finds me? Lisa sat next to me, her hand resting gently on my arm. The police said there was no evidence of an attack. Maybe it was just... Don't, I cut her off, my voice sharp. Don't tell me it was all in my head. I know what I experienced. Lisa held up her hands in a placating gesture. Okay, I'm sorry. I just hate seeing you like this. Have you considered talking to someone? A therapist, maybe? I shook my head vehemently. They'll just think I'm crazy like everyone else does. Not everyone thinks you're crazy, Lisa insisted. We're just worried about you. You haven't been to work in days, you barely eat, you jump at every sound. As if on cue, my phone buzzed with an incoming text. I flinched, nearly dropping it as I fumbled to check the message. Unknown number. I see you, little dear. You can't hide forever. The blood drained from my face as I stared at the screen, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold the phone. Clara, what is it? Lisa asked, leaning over to look at my phone. Who's that from? I shoved the phone into her hands, leaping up from the couch. It's him. He's found me. I ran to the window, peering out through a crack in the curtains. The street below looked normal, people going about their day, oblivious to the terror gripping me. Clara, calm down, Lisa said, reading the message. This could just be a prank, some sick joke. A joke? I whirled on her, my voice rising hysterically. You think this is funny? He called me little deer. That's what he called me in the forest. How could anyone else know that? Lisa stood, approaching me slowly as if I were a wild animal about to bolt. Okay, let's think about this rationally. Have you told the police about this message? I laughed bitterly. The police? They don't believe anything I say. They think I made it all up. Then we'll make them listen, Lisa said firmly. This is evidence, Clara, proof that someone is targeting you. As Lisa spoke, a news alert flashed on the TV screen. I grabbed the remote, unmuting it just in time to hear the reporter's grim announcement. Breaking news. The body of missing hiker Sarah Mitchell has been found in Redwood Forest. Police are treating the death as suspicious and are asking anyone with information to come forward. The remote slipped from my numb fingers, clattering to the floor. Lisa gasped beside me, her hand covering her mouth in shock. "Oh my God," she whispered. "Clara, you were right. All this time, you were telling the truth." I couldn't speak, couldn't move. The room seemed to spin around me as the reality of the situation crashed over me. Sarah was dead. The killer was real, and he knew where I was. "We need to go to the police," Lisa said, grabbing my shoulders. "Right now. This changes everything." I nodded numbly, allowing Lisa to guide me towards the door. As we stepped into the hallway, my phone buzzed again. With trembling hands, I looked at the new message. Unknown number. You should have stayed quiet, little dear. Now the hunt begins again. As Lisa pulled me towards the elevator, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were walking into a trap. The killer was out there, watching, waiting, and I knew with a certainty that chilled me to my core that this nightmare was far from over. The police station buzzed with activity as Lisa and I pushed through the doors. My legs felt like lead, each step an effort as the reality of Sarah's death and the killer's threats weighed heavily upon me. Detective Morales looked up from her desk as we approached, her expression a mix of surprise and concern. "Miss Hamilton? What are you doing here?" I opened my mouth to speak, but the words caught in my throat. Lisa stepped forward, placing a supportive hand on my back. "Detective," Lisa began, her voice steady. "Clara's received threatening messages. We think they're from the killer." Detective Morales' eyebrows shot up. "That's a serious accusation. Do you have these messages?" With shaking hands, I pulled out my phone and handed it to her. As she read, her face grew grim. "This changes things," she muttered, more to herself than to us. She looked up, her gaze sharp. "Clara, I owe you an apology. We should have taken your claims more seriously from the start." A wave of relief washed over me, quickly followed by a surge of anger. It shouldn't have taken Sarah's death to make you believe me. Detective Morales flinched slightly at my words. "You're right. We dropped the ball on this one, but I promise you, we're going to do everything in our power to catch this killer and keep you safe." She led us to a small conference room where Detective Johnson was already waiting. As we sat down, I couldn't help but notice the tension in the room. "So," Detective Johnson began, his voice carefully neutral, "tell us everything, from the beginning." For the next hour, I recounted every detail I could remember. The hike, finding Sarah, the chase through the woods, and now the threatening messages. As I spoke, Detective Morales typed furiously on a laptop, while Detective Johnson paced the room, his brow furrowed in concentration. When I finished, a heavy silence fell over the room. "There's something else," I said quietly, my eyes flicking between the two detectives. "The button we found in the woods, the one from a police uniform." Detective Johnson stopped pacing abruptly. "What are you implying, Miss Hamilton?" I took a deep breath, steeling myself. "Is it possible? Could the killer be a cop?" The tension in the room ratcheted up several notches. Detective Morales' fingers hovered over her keyboard, frozen in mid-type. That's a very serious accusation, Detective Johnson said, his voice low and dangerous. I know, I replied, forcing myself to meet his gaze. But it would explain how he knows the forest so well, how he's managed to avoid detection, maybe even how he got my number. Lisa squeezed my hand under the table, a silent show of support. Detective Morales cleared her throat. We can't rule anything out at this point, but Clara, you need to understand. If what you're saying is true, it means you might not be safe anywhere. A chill ran down my spine at her words. What do you mean? If the killer is indeed one of our own, Detective Johnson explained, his voice tight, he would have access to our systems, our protocols. He'd know every move we make to protect you. The room seemed to close in around me, the walls pressing closer. I struggled to draw breath, panic clawing at my chest. So what do we do? Lisa asked, her voice small in the oppressive silence. Detective Morales leaned forward, her eyes intense. We keep this suspicion between us for now. Clara, we're going to put you in protective custody, but we'll need to be smart about it. No official records, no standard safe houses. I have a cabin, Detective Johnson said suddenly. It's off the grid, about 3 hours north. No one in the department knows about it. Detective Morales nodded. That could work. We'll need to move quickly, though. Clara, can you be ready to leave in an hour? My head spun with the rapid-fire changes. Yes, I think so. But what about my job? My family? We'll take care of it, Detective Morales assured me. As far as anyone else is concerned, you're taking some personal time to recover from your ordeal in the woods. As we stood to leave, my phone buzzed again. With trembling hands, I checked the message. Unknown number. Run all you want, little dear. The hunt is just beginning. I showed the message to the detectives, watching as their faces hardened with resolve. We'll find this bastard, Detective Johnson growled. I promise you that. As we left the station, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the parking lot. I couldn't shake the feeling that somewhere in those shadows, a predator was watching, waiting for his moment to strike. Lisa hugged me tightly before I got into Detective Johnson's unmarked car. Stay safe, she whispered. I'll be here when you get back. As we pulled away from the station, I watched my normal life recede in the rearview mirror. Ahead lay uncertainty, fear, and danger, but also perhaps the chance to finally bring a killer to justice. The hunt was indeed beginning, but this time, I wouldn't be the prey. This time, I was determined to be the hunter. The cabin loomed before us, a dark silhouette against the star-studded sky. After hours of driving through winding mountain roads, Detective Johnson's headlights illuminated the weathered wooden structure. It was smaller than I'd imagined, nestled among towering pines that seemed to whisper secrets in the night breeze. Home sweet home, Detective Johnson muttered, killing the engine. At least for now. I stepped out of the car, stretching my stiff limbs. The mountain air was crisp and clean, a stark contrast to the stuffy interior of the vehicle. Despite the circumstances, I couldn't help but take a deep breath, savoring the scent of pine and wilderness. It's quaint, I offered, trying to sound more optimistic than I felt. Detective Johnson chuckled, a sound devoid of humor. It's not much, but it's off the grid and secure. That's what matters right now. We carried our bags inside, and Johnson gave me a quick tour. The cabin was indeed small, a combined living room and kitchen, a tiny bathroom, and 2 small bedrooms. Everything was basic, functional, and covered in a thin layer of dust. I haven't been up here in months, Johnson explained, flicking on lights and opening windows. But the generator's full, and there's enough canned food to last us a while. I nodded, setting my bag down in one of the bedrooms. How long do you think we'll need to stay here? Johnson's face hardened. As long as it takes to catch this bastard. Could be days, could be weeks. We're in this for the long haul, Clara. The reality of the situation hit me anew. I was essentially in hiding, cut off from my entire life, with no clear end in sight. I sank onto the bed, suddenly overwhelmed. "Hey," Johnson said, his voice softening slightly. "I know this isn't easy, but you're safe here. We'll figure this out." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. Johnson awkwardly patted my shoulder before retreating to the other room, leaving me alone with my thoughts. Sleep was elusive that night. Every creak of the cabin, every rustle of wind through the trees had me on edge. When I finally did drift off, my dreams were filled with shadowy figures and endless forest chases. I awoke to the smell of coffee and the sound of Johnson's voice. Confused and groggy, I made my way to the main room. Johnson was hunched over a laptop, talking in low, urgent tones. "Any leads yet?" "Damn it, Sarah, we need something to go on." I froze, realizing he was talking to Detective Morales. Johnson noticed me and held up a finger, signaling me to wait. "All right, keep me posted. And Sarah, be careful. We don't know who we can trust." He ended the call and turned to me. "Morning. Coffee's ready if you want some." I poured myself a cup, my mind racing. "Any news?" Johnson sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Nothing concrete yet. They're combing through Sarah Mitchell's background, trying to find any connection to our killer, but it's slow going." I nodded, sipping the bitter coffee. "What can I do to help?" "For now, stay safe and stay hidden," Johnson replied. "I know it's frustrating, but you're our best witness. We need to keep you alive and out of the killer's reach." The day passed slowly. I tried to keep myself occupied, cleaning the dusty cabin and taking short walks around the perimeter under Johnson's watchful eye. But the inaction was maddening. Every moment I spent hiding felt like a victory for the killer. As evening approached, I found myself standing on the small porch, watching the sun set behind the mountains. Johnson joined me, his presence a mix of comfort and unease. "Penny for your thoughts?" he asked, leaning against the railing. I sighed. I feel so helpless. He's out there, probably hurting more people, and I'm stuck here doing nothing." Johnson nodded slowly. "I get it. But you're doing more than you realize. Your testimony, your courage in coming forward, it's given us a chance to catch this guy." "But what if it's not enough?" I whispered, voicing the fear that had been gnawing at me. "What if he really is a cop? How can we stop someone who's always one step ahead?" Johnson was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was low and intense. "We stop him by being smarter, by working harder, and by never giving up. This bastard thinks he's untouchable, but he's made mistakes. He'll make more." I turned to look at him, struck by the fierce determination in his eyes. For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt a glimmer of hope. "So what's our next move?" I asked. Johnson smiled grimly. "Tomorrow, we start going through everything we know, every detail, no matter how small. There's a connection we're missing, and we're going to find it." As darkness fell, we retreated inside. The cabin felt less oppressive now, more like a fortress than a prison. I knew the road ahead would be long and dangerous, but I was ready to fight. That night, as I lay in bed, I made a silent promise to Sarah Mitchell and all the killer's other victims. We would bring him to justice no matter the cost. The hunt was on, and this time, we were the predators. The next morning dawned crisp and clear, sunlight filtering through the cabin's dusty windows. I found Detective Johnson already at work, papers spread across the small kitchen table, his laptop open beside a steaming mug of coffee. "Morning," he grunted, barely looking up as I entered. "Hope you're ready for a long day." I poured myself some coffee and joined him at the table. "Where do we start?" Johnson pushed a stack of papers towards me. "These are all the case files we have on Sarah Mitchell's disappearance and the other suspicious deaths in Redwood Forest over the past 5 years. We need to go through everything, looking for any connections we might have missed." I nodded, picking up the first file. "What exactly are we looking for?" "Anything unusual," Johnson replied. "Similarities between victims, strange details in their backgrounds, Witnesses who saw something off. Our killer has a pattern. We just need to find it. For hours, we pored over the files, making notes and discussing theories. As the day wore on, a disturbing pattern began to emerge. "Johnson," I said, my voice tense with realization. "Look at this. All of these victims, they were all involved in some kind of environmental activism." Johnson leaned over, his brow furrowed. "You're right. Sarah Mitchell was protesting a new logging operation, and this one, James Torres, he was leading a campaign against a proposed mining project near the forest." "It can't be a coincidence," I insisted. "The killer must be targeting these activists for a reason." Johnson nodded slowly. "Good catch, Clara. This could be the break we needed." Just then, Johnson's secure phone buzzed. He answered it, his expression growing more serious by the second. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice tight. "All right, keep me posted. And Sarah, watch your back." He hung up, turning to me with grim determination. That was Morales. They found another body in the forest, a local journalist who was investigating the environmental controversies in the area. My blood ran cold. "He's escalating." Johnson nodded. "Looks like it. But this might be the mistake we've been waiting for. Morales said there was evidence of a struggle this time. They're processing the scene now, hoping for DNA or other physical evidence." I stood up, pacing the small cabin. "We can't just sit here while he kills more people. There has to be something we can do." Johnson was quiet for a moment, then spoke hesitantly. "There might be, but it's risky." I turned to face him. "What is it?" He sighed, rubbing his temples. "We could set a trap, use me as bait." "What? No!" I exclaimed. "It's too dangerous." "Hear me out," Johnson insisted. "We know the killer is targeting people involved in environmental issues. I could pose as a journalist, start asking questions about the logging and mining operations. Draw him out." I shook my head vehemently. "It's too risky. What if something goes wrong?" Johnson stood, placing a hand on my shoulder. "Clara, we're running out of options. More people will die if we don't stop him soon." I knew he was right, but the thought of putting him in danger made my stomach churn. "If we do this, we need a solid plan, and backup." Johnson nodded. "Agreed. We'll coordinate with Morales, set up surveillance. Do this by the book." As we started to hash out the details of the plan, a noise outside made us both freeze. It was faint, barely audible, but unmistakable, the sound of a twig snapping under someone's foot. Johnson motioned for me to be quiet, drawing his gun as he moved silently towards the window. I held my breath, my heart pounding in my chest. Peering through the curtains, Johnson scanned the area. After a tense moment, he relaxed slightly. "Probably just an animal," he murmured. "But we should be more careful. No more going outside unless absolutely necessary." I nodded, but couldn't shake the feeling of unease. As night fell, casting long shadows through the trees, I found myself jumping at every sound, every shifting shadow. Later that night, as I lay in bed trying to sleep, a thought struck me. I got up and padded quietly to Johnson's room, knocking softly. "Come in," he called. I opened the door to find him still awake, poring over case files. "I just thought of something," I said. "The killer, he must have access to information about these environmental projects and the people opposing them. That kind of detailed knowledge, it has to come from somewhere." Johnson's eyes widened as he caught on to my train of thought. "You're right. He'd need inside information, which means he's connected to the companies behind these projects," I finished, "maybe even working for them directly." Johnson nodded, a spark of excitement in his eyes. "This is good, Clara. Really good. It narrows down our suspect pool significantly." As we started to discuss this new lead, Johnson's phone buzzed with a text. He checked it, his face paling as he read. "What is it?" I asked, dread pooling in my stomach. Johnson turned the phone so I could see the message. It was from an unknown number containing just 5 words. I see you, little dear. The realization hit us both at the same moment. The killer hadn't just found us. The cabin erupted into frenzied activity. Detective Johnson sprang into action, his training kicking in as he secured the doors and windows. Get your shoes on, he barked at me. We need to be ready to move. My hands shook as I laced up my hiking boots. How did he find us? I whispered, fear constricting my throat. Johnson's face was grim. I don't know, but we can't stay here. It's not safe anymore. He grabbed his go bag and tossed me a small backpack. Emergency supplies, he explained. Water, energy bars, first aid kit. Take it. As I shouldered the pack, a loud crash echoed through the cabin. The front door splintered inward, wood flying everywhere. Johnson pushed me behind him, his gun drawn and ready. Police! Drop your weapon! He shouted. But the figure that stepped through the broken door wasn't what either of us expected. It was Detective Morales. Sarah? Johnson lowered his gun slightly, confusion etched on his face. What the hell are you doing here? Morales stepped further into the cabin, her own weapon trained on Johnson. Put the gun down, Mike, she said, her voice cold and unfamiliar. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. It's you, I breathed. You're the killer. A cruel smile twisted Morales' lips. Smart girl. Took you long enough to figure it out. Johnson's grip on his gun tightened. Sarah, why? How could you do this? Oh, spare me the righteous indignation, Mike, Morales spat. You have no idea what's really going on here. Then enlighten us, I said, surprising myself with the steadiness of my voice. Morales' eyes flickered to me. It's bigger than you can imagine, little dear. Those tree huggers and nosy reporters? They were getting too close to the truth. I was just cleaning up the mess. What truth? Johnson demanded. The forest holds secrets, Morales said, her eyes gleaming with a fanatical light. Ancient power that some very important people want to keep hidden, and they pay well to keep it that way. I felt sick. You murdered innocent people for money? Morales laughed, a harsh, grating sound. Money? This is about power, girl. The kind of power that can reshape the world. As she spoke, I noticed Johnson slowly inching to the side, trying to get a better angle. Morales noticed too. Don't even think about it, Mike, she warned. I really don't want to kill you, but I will if I have to. You won't get away with this, Sarah, Johnson said, his voice tight with anger and betrayal. Morales smirked. I already have. By the time anyone finds your bodies, I'll be long gone. In that moment, several things happened at once. Johnson lunged for Morales, I dove for cover, and a gunshot rang out, deafeningly loud in the small cabin. I heard a grunt of pain and the thud of a body hitting the floor. Peering out from behind the couch, I saw Johnson on the ground clutching his shoulder. Blood seeped between his fingers. Morales stood over him, gun aimed at his head. You always were too noble for your own good, Mike, she said, almost sadly. No, I shouted, desperation giving me courage. I grabbed the nearest object, a heavy lamp, and hurled it at Morales. She ducked, the lamp shattering against the wall behind her. It was enough of a distraction for Johnson to kick out, catching Morales in the knee. She stumbled and Johnson lunged for her gun. They grappled on the floor, each fighting for control of the weapon. Another shot rang out, and I screamed, unable to tell who had been hit. Then suddenly, the cabin was plunged into darkness. The generator must have failed, or maybe a stray bullet had hit it. In the pitch black, I heard grunts of exertion, the thud of fists connecting with flesh. I fumbled in my backpack for the flashlight I knew was there, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. As my fingers closed around the flashlight, a final gunshot pierced the darkness, followed by an eerie silence. With trembling hands, I switched on the light, sweeping its beam across the cabin. Johnson lay on the floor, blood pooling beneath him. Morales was nowhere to be seen. Johnson, I cried, rushing to his side. Oh God, please be alive. He groaned, his eyes fluttering open. "Clara, you okay?" I nodded, tears of relief streaming down my face. "I'm fine. Where's Morales?" Johnson tried to sit up, wincing in pain. "She got away. Damn it, we can't let her escape." I helped him to his feet, supporting his weight. "You're hurt. We need to get you to a hospital." He shook his head stubbornly. "No time. She'll disappear if we don't go after her now." "But, Clara," he cut me off, his eyes intense. "This is our only chance to end this. Are you with me?" I took a deep breath, steeling myself. Despite the fear coursing through me, I knew he was right. We had come too far to give up now. "I'm with you," I said firmly. Johnson nodded, grimacing as he checked his gun. "Then let's go hunt a killer." As we stepped out into the dark forest, the wind whispered through the trees, carrying with it a promise of danger and the faint metallic scent of blood. The final chase had begun, and only one predator would emerge victorious. The aftermath of our narrow escape from the cabin left us reeling. Detective Johnson and I found ourselves in a dingy motel room on the outskirts of a small town, our nerves frayed and our trust in each other hanging by a thread. The events of the past few days played on a loop in my mind, each replay raising more questions than answers. "We need to talk about what happened," I said, breaking the tense silence that had settled between us since we'd checked in. Johnson looked up from his laptop, his eyes bloodshot from lack of sleep. "What's there to talk about? We were compromised, we got out. End of story." I shook my head, frustration bubbling up inside me. "No, not end of story. How did he find us, Johnson? That cabin was supposed to be off the grid, known only to you." He sighed, running a hand through his disheveled hair. "I don't know, Clara. I've been asking myself the same question." "Could you have been followed?" I pressed, unable to shake the nagging suspicion that had been growing since our escape. Johnson's eyes flashed with anger. "What are you implying?" I took a deep breath, steeling myself. "I'm implying that either you're incredibly careless or what?" he snapped. "Or you're not who you say you are," I finished, my heart pounding. The silence that followed was deafening. Johnson stared at me, his expression unreadable. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and dangerous. "You think I'm the killer?" I stood my ground, even as fear coursed through me. "I think that someone in the police department is involved. The evidence points to it, and right now you're the only cop I'm with." Johnson laughed bitterly. "After everything we've been through, you still don't trust me?" "Trust has to be earned," I retorted. "And right now, I'm not sure who I can trust." He stood abruptly, pacing the small room. "Fine. You want the truth? Here it is. I think there's a leak in the department. Someone who's been feeding information to the killer. That's how he found us at the cabin." I felt a chill run down my spine. "A leak? Who?" Johnson shook his head. "I don't know, but it has to be someone with access to our case files, our communications." "Like Detective Morales?" I suggested, hating myself for even thinking it. Johnson's face hardened. "Sarah's been my partner for years. I trust her with my life." "But can you be sure?" I pressed. Before he could answer, his phone buzzed. He checked it, his face paling. "It's Morales," he said. "There's been another murder." My stomach dropped. "Who?" Johnson's voice was grim as he read the message. "Lisa. Your friend Lisa." The world seemed to tilt on its axis. I stumbled, gripping the edge of the bed for support. "No," I whispered. "Not Lisa." Johnson moved to comfort me, but I recoiled. "Don't touch me." He stepped back, hands raised. "Clara, I'm sorry. I know she was your friend." Tears stung my eyes as anger and grief warred within me. "This is my fault. He's targeting people close to me now." "It's not your fault," Johnson insisted. "It's his, and we're going to stop him." I looked up at him, suddenly feeling very small and very alone. "How? We don't even know who to trust anymore." Johnson was quiet for a moment, then spoke with renewed determination. We go back to where it all started. The forest? I asked, a shiver running through me at the thought. He nodded. It's where he operates, where he feels most comfortable. If we want to catch him, that's where we need to be. I knew he was right, but the idea of returning to that place of terror filled me with dread. What if it's a trap? It probably is, Johnson admitted. But it's also our best chance of ending this. As we began to plan our return to Redwood Forest, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were walking into the lion's den. But with Lisa's death weighing heavily on my conscience, I knew we had no choice. Johnson, I said as we prepared to leave the motel, if we do this, we need to be clear on one thing. He looked at me, waiting. No more secrets, I continued. No more suspicion. If we're going to survive this, we need to trust each other completely. Can you do that? Johnson held my gaze for a long moment before nodding. No more secrets, he agreed. As we stepped out into the night, the weight of our mission settled over us like a shroud. The killer was out there, waiting. And this time, we were bringing the fight to him. Little did we know, the forest held secrets darker than we could have imagined, and the line between hunter and hunted was about to blur in ways we never expect. The redwood forest loomed before us, a wall of ancient trees shrouded in mist. As Johnson parked the car at the trailhead, I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the early morning air. We were back where it all began, and the forest seemed to be holding its breath, waiting. You ready for this? Johnson asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. We gathered our gear, backpacks filled with supplies, flashlights, and Johnson's service weapon, and set off into the trees. The forest was eerily quiet as we hiked, our footsteps muffled by the thick carpet of pine needles. Every snapping twig, every rustle of leaves had me on edge, my eyes darting from shadow to shadow. Where exactly are we going? I finally asked, breaking the tense silence. Johnson consulted a map he'd pulled from his pocket. There's an old ranger station about 5 miles in. It's been abandoned for years, but it's the kind of place our killer might use as a base of operations. As we pushed deeper into the forest, the trees seemed to close in around us, blocking out more and more of the sky. The air grew thick and heavy, filled with the musty scent of decaying vegetation. Johnson, I said, my voice tight with fear. Do you get the feeling we're being watched? He nodded grimly. Since we entered the forest, keep your eyes open and stay close. We trudged on for what felt like hours, the forest growing darker and more oppressive with each step. Finally, we emerged into a small clearing. In the center stood a dilapidated wooden structure, the ranger station. Johnson held up a hand, signaling me to stop. Something's not right, he muttered, his eyes scanning the area. I followed his gaze, and that's when I saw it. A thin trail of smoke rising from the station's chimney. Someone's here, I whispered. Johnson drew his weapon. Stay behind me, he ordered, moving slowly towards the building. As we approached, a twig snapped loudly under my foot. We froze, holding our breath. For a moment, all was silent. Then suddenly, a figure burst from the station's door, sprinting into the trees. Police! Stop! Johnson shouted, taking off after the runner. I hesitated for a split second before following, my heart pounding in my ears. We crashed through the underbrush, branches whipping at our faces as we pursued the shadowy figure. Suddenly, Johnson stumbled, crying out in pain. I skidded to a stop beside him. My ankle, he gasped. I think it's sprained. I looked up, but our quarry had vanished into the forest. We lost him, I panted. Johnson struggled to his feet, leaning heavily on me. We need to get back to the station, he said through gritted teeth. There might be evidence inside. We limped back to the clearing, Johnson's arm draped over my shoulders. As we neared the station, a glint of metal caught my eye. Wait, I said, bending down to examine the object half buried in the leaves. It was a police badge. Johnson took it, his face pale. It's Morales, he whispered. A cold dread settled in my stomach. What does this mean? Before Johnson could answer, a voice called out from the trees behind us. It means you should have stayed away, little dear. We whirled around to see a figure step out of the shadows, a gun trained on us. My breath caught in my throat as recognition dawned. Detective Morales? I gasped. She smiled, but it was a cold, predatory expression that sent shivers down my spine. Hello, Clara. Mike. So nice of you to join me. Johnson's grip on my shoulder tightened. Sarah, what the hell is going on? Morales' eyes flashed with a manic gleam. What's going on is that I'm finishing what I started. You two have been quite the thorn in my side. My mind reeled, struggling to process this betrayal. You're the killer, but why? Why? Morales laughed, a harsh, bitter sound. Because someone had to protect these forests. These activists were nothing but a threat, pushing for development that would destroy everything. So you murdered them? Johnson's voice was filled with disgust. Your job was to protect people, Sarah. I am protecting people, Morales snapped. Protecting the future, the environment. Sometimes sacrifices have to be made for the greater good. As she spoke, I noticed Johnson slowly shifting his weight, angling himself between me and Morales. I realized he was going to try something desperate. It's over, Sarah, he said, his voice steady. Put down the gun. For a moment, the forest held its breath. Then several things happened at once. Johnson lunged forward, aiming to disarm Morales. I dove to the side as a gunshot rang out, echoing through the trees. There was a grunt of pain, a thud, and then silence. I looked up to see Johnson on the ground, blood seeping from a wound in his shoulder. Morales stood over him, her gun now trained on me. Oh, Clara, she sighed, almost sadly. You should have stayed lost in these woods the first time. Now I'm afraid you'll have to join the others. Permanently. As Morales' finger tightened on the trigger, I closed my eyes, bracing for the impact. But fate, it seemed, had other plans for me in this dark heart of the redwood forest. The gunshot never came. Instead, a thunderous crack echoed through the forest, followed by the splintering of wood. I opened my eyes to see a massive tree branch crashing down between Morales and me, narrowly missing us both. Morales stumbled back, momentarily stunned. In that split second of distraction, I acted on pure instinct. I lunged forward, tackling her to the ground. We grappled in the dirt, fighting for control of the gun. You don't understand, Morales snarled, her eyes wild. I'm doing what needs to be done. I gritted my teeth, straining against her strength. You're a murderer, nothing more. As we struggled, the gun went off again, the bullet burying itself harmlessly in the earth. The sound seemed to snap Johnson out of his pain-induced haze. Clara, he shouted, his voice strained. The taser in my pack. I remembered the non-lethal weapon Johnson had packed as a precaution. With a surge of desperate energy, I broke free from Morales' grip and scrambled towards Johnson's fallen backpack. Morales was right behind me, her fingers grasping at my ankle. You can't stop this, Clara. The forest needs me. I kicked back, my foot connecting with her face. She reeled, giving me the precious seconds I needed to reach the pack. My hands shook as I fumbled with the zipper, acutely aware of Morales recovering behind me. Finally, my fingers closed around the taser. I whirled around just as Morales lunged at me, her face contorted with rage. This ends now, I said, and pulled the trigger. The taser's prongs hit Morales square in the chest. She convulsed, a strangled cry escaping her lips before she collapsed to the ground, unconscious. For a moment, all I could hear was my own ragged breathing and the faint buzzing of insects. Then reality crashed back in. Johnson! I rushed to his side, my hands hovering uncertainly over his wounded shoulder. He groaned, his face pale with pain and blood loss. Nice. Nice work, Clara, he managed to say through gritted teeth. I tore off a strip of my shirt, pressing it against his wound. We need to get you out of here. Can you walk? Johnson nodded weakly. What about her? He jerked his chin towards Morales's prone form. I glanced at the unconscious detective, conflict warring within me. Part of me wanted to leave her there, to let her face the same fear and isolation she'd inflicted on her victims. But I knew we couldn't. We'll take her with us, I decided. She needs to face justice for what she's done. Using strips torn from our clothes and some rope from Johnson's pack, we secured Morales's hands and feet. As I worked, my mind raced, trying to process everything that had happened. I can't believe it was her all along, I murmured, more to myself than to Johnson. He sighed heavily. Sometimes the monsters we're chasing are closer than we think. I should have seen it. The way she always seemed to know more than she should about the case. I helped Johnson to his feet, letting him lean on me. You couldn't have known she was your partner. Yeah, he said bitterly. Some partner. We began the long, arduous trek back through the forest, dragging the still unconscious Morales between us. Every step was a struggle, with Johnson's injury and the extra weight. As we walked, the forest around us seemed to change. The oppressive darkness lifted, replaced by dappled sunlight filtering through the canopy. Birds began to sing again, and a gentle breeze rustled the leaves. It's like the forest knows, I mused. Like it's breathing a sigh of relief now that she's been stopped. Johnson managed a weak chuckle. Maybe, or maybe we're just seeing it clearly for the first time, without fear clouding our vision. We paused at the edge of a small stream to rest and drink. As I helped Johnson sit, a thought struck me. What she said about protecting the forest. Do you think she really believed that's what she was doing? Johnson was quiet for a moment, his gaze distant. I think she started with good intentions. But somewhere along the way, she lost sight of what really matters. She forgot that the point of protecting nature is to protect people, not the other way around. I nodded, looking out at the majestic redwoods surrounding us. It's beautiful here, peaceful. Hard to believe it was the scene of so much horror. That's the thing about darkness, Johnson said softly. It can hide anywhere, even in the most beautiful places. But so can light. As we resumed our journey, I felt a weight lifting from my shoulders. The nightmare wasn't over. We still had a long way to go, both literally and figuratively. But for the first time since this ordeal began, I felt hope. The forest had held secrets, terrors, and betrayals, but it had also shown me my own strength, the power of trust, and the importance of fighting for what's right, even in the darkest of times. As we finally emerged from the tree line, the sun warm on our faces, I knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, we would face them. Together we had unraveled the mystery and brought a killer to justice. And in doing so, we had reclaimed the redwood forest, not just as a place of natural beauty, but as a symbol of resilience and hope. The days following our harrowing encounter in the redwood forest passed in a blur of police statements, hospital visits, and media frenzy. Detective Sarah Morales's arrest sent shockwaves through the law enforcement community and beyond. As the full extent of her crimes came to light, I found myself thrust into a spotlight I never wanted. A week after our return from the forest, I sat in a quiet corner of the hospital cafeteria, nursing a lukewarm cup of coffee. Detective Johnson, his arm now in a sling, slid into the seat across from me. "How are you holding up?" he asked, his voice laced with concern. I shrugged, staring into my coffee. "As well as can be expected, I suppose. You?" Johnson sighed, running his good hand through his hair. "Been better. The internal affairs investigation is in full swing. They're questioning everyone who ever worked with Morales." "Do they think there were others involved?" I asked, a chill running down my spine at the thought. He shook his head. "No, but they need to be thorough. Make sure there weren't any warning signs we missed." We sat in silence for a moment, the weight of recent events hanging heavily between us. "Have you spoken to her?" I finally asked, unable to keep the question at bay any longer. Johnson's face darkened. Once. She's not well, Clara. The psychologists say she's had a complete break from reality. She still believes she was doing the right thing. I shuddered, remembering the wild look in Morales' eyes as she'd pointed her gun at me. How could someone sworn to protect and serve end up so twisted? It's not always a straight line from good to evil, Johnson mused. Sometimes people lose their way gradually, convincing themselves that the ends justify the means. Our conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a stern-looking woman in a crisp suit. Detective Johnson? Ms. Hamilton? I'm Agent Rossi with the FBI. We need to talk. Johnson and I exchanged wary glances before following Agent Rossi to a private conference room. As we settled into our seats, I couldn't shake the feeling that this ordeal was far from over. Agent Rossi wasted no time with pleasantries. We've been investigating Detective Morales' activities, and we've uncovered some disturbing information. It appears her crimes may have extended beyond the Redwood Forest. What do you mean? Johnson leaned forward, his brow furrowed. Rossi pulled out a file, spreading photos across the table. We've linked Morales to a series of unsolved murders across 3 states, all with a similar MO. Environmental activists or whistleblowers found dead in remote wooded areas. I felt the blood drain from my face as I looked at the photos. So many victims, so many lives cut short. How long has this been going on? By our estimates, at least 5 years, Rossi replied grimly. Morales was very careful, very methodical. She used her position as a detective to stay one step ahead of any investigations. Johnson slammed his fist on the table, making me jump. Damn it! I worked with her for years. How did I not see this? Rossi's expression softened slightly. Don't blame yourself, detective. Morales was exceptionally skilled at compartmentalizing. Even her closest colleagues had no idea of her true nature. I cleared my throat, finding my voice. What happens now? Now, Rossi said, leaning back in her chair. We need your help, both of you. You're the only ones who've seen Morales in action, who've heard her justify her crimes. We need you to help us understand her mindset, her motivations. It could be crucial in building a case against her and potentially solving these other murders. Johnson and I shared a look, a silent understanding passing between us. We'd been through hell together, and now we had a chance to bring some closure to the families of Morales' other victims. We're in, Johnson said firmly. Whatever you need. As Agent Rossi began outlining the next steps, I felt a mix of emotions wash over me. Fear at the thought of delving deeper into Morales' twisted psyche, determination to see justice served for all her victims, and a glimmer of hope that perhaps, by facing this darkness head-on, we could finally begin to heal. The sun was setting as we left the hospital, casting long shadows across the parking lot. Johnson paused, turning to face me. Clara, he said softly, I want you to know, I couldn't have done this without you. Your strength, your perseverance, it's remarkable. I felt a lump form in my throat. We did it together, I managed to say. And we'll see this through together too. As we walked to our cars, the weight of what lay ahead settled over us. The battle in the Redwood Forest might be over, but the war against the darkness Morales represented was just beginning. Yet as I looked at Johnson, I knew we were ready to face whatever came next. The road ahead would be long and fraught with challenges, but we had emerged from the shadow of the redwoods stronger and more determined than ever. Whatever secrets still lurked in the depths of Morales' past, we would bring them to light, one by one, until justice was served for every life she had destroyed. As I drove home that evening, the setting sun painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, I felt a sense of purpose I hadn't experienced since this nightmare began. The forest had changed me, tested me, but it hadn't broken me. And now, with the truth finally coming to light, I was ready to face whatever darkness still lay ahead. The weeks following our meeting with Agent Rossi blurred into a whirlwind of activity. Johnson and I found ourselves immersed in a world of cold cases, forensic reports, and psychological profiles. The FBI had set up a temporary task force in our local precinct, dedicated to unraveling the full extent of Sarah Morales' crimes. On a crisp autumn morning, I arrived at the precinct to find Johnson already hunched over a stack of files, his coffee going cold beside him. "You're here early," I remarked, setting down a fresh cup next to him. He looked up, dark circles under his eyes betraying his lack of sleep. "Couldn't rest. I think I found something." I pulled up a chair, curiosity piqued. "What is it?" Johnson spread out several photos on the desk. They showed various forest scenes, each marked as a crime scene. "Look at these. Notice anything?" I leaned in, studying the images carefully. At first, nothing stood out, but then I saw it. In each photo, partially hidden by leaves or brush, was a small carved wooden figure. "The figures," I breathed. "They're at every scene." Johnson nodded grimly. "Exactly. We missed it before because they weren't always found with the bodies, but they were there at every single crime scene." "A signature," I murmured. "But why? What do they mean?" Before Johnson could respond, Agent Rossi strode into the room, her face set in a grim expression. "We've got another one," she announced. My heart sank. "Another victim?" Rossi shook her head. "No, another killer. We've linked 3 more murders to a different perpetrator. Same MO, same victim profile, but in a different state." Johnson stood up so quickly he almost knocked over his chair. "What? Are you saying Morales had an accomplice?" "Not an accomplice," Rossi corrected. "A copycat, or possibly a mentor." The implications of her words sent a chill down my spine. "You think Morales learned from someone else? That she's not the original killer?" Rossi nodded, her expression grave. "It's a possibility we can't ignore. The earlier killings show less refinement, less artistry, for lack of a better word. It's as if the killer was still perfecting their technique." Johnson ran a hand through his hair, frustration evident in every line of his body. "So we're back to square one. How the hell do we find this other killer?" "We start by talking to Morales again," Rossi said firmly. "If she did learn from someone, she might be willing to give them up in exchange for leniency." I felt a knot form in my stomach at the thought of facing Morales again. "Do you really think she'll cooperate?" Rossi's eyes met mine, a hint of sympathy in their depths. "That's where you come in, Clara. You've faced her before. You understand her in a way none of us do. We need you to talk to her." The room fell silent as the weight of her request settled over me. Johnson placed a supportive hand on my shoulder. "You don't have to do this if you're not comfortable, Clara." I took a deep breath, steeling myself. "No, I'll do it. If there's even a chance it could help catch this other killer, I have to try." The drive to the secure psychiatric facility where Morales was being held was tense and silent. As we pulled up to the imposing building, Rossi turned to me in the back seat. "Remember, Clara, Morales is likely to try and manipulate you. Don't let her get under your skin. We just need information." I nodded, my mouth too dry to speak. As we were led through sterile hallways to the interview room, I tried to prepare myself for what was to come. Nothing could have readied me for the sight of Sarah Morales, once a respected detective, now clad in a hospital gown, her wrists shackled to the table. Her eyes lit up with an unsettling gleam as I entered the room. "Clara," she purred, a smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "I knew you'd come back to me eventually. Did you miss our little chats in the forest?" I swallowed hard, forcing myself to meet her gaze. "We're not here to reminisce, Morales. We need information." She leaned back, the chains on her wrists clinking. "Information? Oh, I have plenty of that. The question is, what are you willing to give me in return?" As I sat down across from her, I could feel the weight of Johnson and Rossi's gazes through the one-way mirror. This was it. The moment that could break open the case or send us spiraling down another dead end. Let's talk about the wooden figures, I said, pushing a photo across the table. Where did you learn to make these? Morales's eyes flickered with something. Surprise? Fear? It was gone in an instant, replaced by her usual mask of cool amusement. Oh, Clara, she sighed, leaning forward. You have no idea how deep this rabbit hole goes, do you? The figures are just the beginning. There's so much more to the story. As Morales began to speak, her words painting a picture more terrifying than I could have imagined, I realized that our journey into the heart of darkness was far from over. The echoes of the past were about to become a deafening roar, and I wasn't sure any of us were prepared for what we were about to uncover. The room felt smaller with each passing moment as Morales leaned closer, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. The figures, Clara, they're not just signatures. They're messages, warnings to those who would dare to threaten the balance of nature. I forced myself to remain calm, even as my heart raced. Who taught you about these messages, Sarah? Who showed you how to make the figures? A shadow passed over Morales's face, a flicker of something that might have been fear or reverence. He called himself the Guardian. I never knew his real name, but he opened my eyes to the truth. The truth about what? I pressed, careful to keep my voice neutral. Morales's eyes took on a faraway look. About the sacred duty we have to protect the forests, to maintain the balance between man and nature. He showed me that sometimes sacrifices must be made for the greater good. I felt a chill run down my spine. How did you meet him? It was years ago, Morales began, her voice taking on a dreamy quality. I was a rookie cop, working a case in the Cascades. A logger had gone missing, presumed dead. That's when I saw my first figure carved from the wood of an ancient cedar. She paused, her eyes focusing on me with unsettling intensity. He found me that night, as I was examining the scene. He spoke of things I'd never imagined, of the forest's consciousness, of the debt humanity owed to nature. And he offered to teach me how to repay that debt. I leaned forward, my heart pounding. Sarah, we need to find this man. He's still out there, isn't he? Still killing? A small smile played at the corners of Morales's mouth. Oh, Clara, you still don't understand. The Guardian isn't just a man. He's a force of nature itself. You can't stop him any more than you can stop the tide. Before I could respond, there was a commotion outside the room. The door burst open, and Agent Rossi rushed in, her face pale. We need to go now, she said urgently. There's been another murder. I stood quickly, my mind reeling. As I turned to leave, Morales called out, her voice sending shivers down my spine. Remember, Clara, the forest sees all, and it never forgets. The drive to the crime scene was tense, filled with a heavy silence that no one dared to break. As we pulled up to the edge of a dense forest, I could see the flashing lights of police cars and ambulances piercing the early evening gloom. Detective Johnson met us at the police line, his face grim. It's bad, he said quietly. Really bad. As we ducked under the yellow tape, I steeled myself for what we might find. Nothing could have prepared me for the sight that awaited us in the small clearing. A body was suspended from a massive oak tree, intricate rope work forming a macabre web around the victim. But it was the wooden figures that drew my eye, dozens of them, hanging from every branch, surrounding the body like silent sentinels. Oh my God, I whispered, feeling the blood drain from my face. Agent Rossi's voice was tight as she surveyed the scene. This isn't Morales's work. This is... The Guardian, I finished, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. Johnson turned to me, his eyes wide with shock. The Guardian? Clara, what aren't you telling us? I took a deep breath, trying to gather my thoughts. Morales. She talked about a mentor, someone who taught her everything she knew. She called him the Guardian. Rossi's expression hardened. And you're just telling us this now? I didn't have a chance, I protested. You pulled me out of the interview as soon as the call came in about this murder." As we argued, a young officer approached looking pale and shaken. "Detectives, we found something else. You're going to want to see this." He led us to a large boulder at the edge of the clearing. Carved into its surface was a message that made my blood run cold. "The apprentice has failed. The master reclaims his forest. Beware, little deer. The hunt begins anew." The silence that fell over us was deafening. It was Johnson who finally broke it, his voice barely above a whisper. "He knows about you, Clara. This guardian, he's calling you out directly." I felt the weight of their gazes on me, a mix of concern and suspicion. The forest around us seemed to press closer, its shadows deepening as the last light of day faded. As I stood there, surrounded by the evidence of a killer more dangerous than we had ever imagined, I realized that our ordeal in the redwood forest had been just the beginning. The true test was yet to come, and the stakes were higher than ever. "What do we do now?" I asked, my voice sounding small and lost in the vastness of the forest. Agent Rossi straightened her shoulders, her voice firm with resolve. "We do what we've been trained to do. We hunt this monster down no matter where the trail leads us." As night fell over the forest, casting long shadows that seemed to reach for us like grasping fingers, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were no longer the hunters. We had become the prey, drawn into a game whose rules we didn't fully understand. The Guardian was out there, watching and waiting, and somehow I knew that before this was over, I would have to face him alone in the dark heart of his domain. The final confrontation was coming, and the fate of more than just myself hung in the balance. The days following the discovery of the Guardian's gruesome message blurred into a frantic haze of investigation and mounting dread. The FBI had set up a command center in the local police station, walls plastered with photos, timelines, and maps tracing the Guardian's suspected path of destruction across multiple states. I stood before the evidence board, my eyes tracing the red string that connected victim after victim. Each face stared back at me, a silent accusation of our failure to stop this monster sooner. "You need to get some rest." Johnson's voice broke through my reverie. He approached, holding out a steaming cup of coffee. I accepted it gratefully, the warmth seeping into my cold fingers. How can I rest when he's still out there? When he's hunting me? Johnson's face tightened with concern. "We're doing everything we can to keep you safe, Clara. We've got officers watching your apartment and—" "It won't be enough," I cut him off, my voice hollow. "You've seen what he can do. What he knows. Nowhere is safe." Before Johnson could respond, Agent Rossi strode into the room, her face set in grim lines. "We've got something, a potential lead on the Guardian's identity." My heart leapt into my throat. "What? How?" Rossi spread a series of old newspaper clippings on the table. "We've been digging into cold cases that match the Guardian's MO, going back decades. We found this." I leaned in, scanning the yellowed papers. The headline jumped out at me. "Park Ranger missing, foul play suspected." "Thomas Blackwood," Rossi continued, pointing to a photo of a stern-faced man in a ranger's uniform. "He disappeared from Redwood National Park in 1985. His body was never found, but investigators at the time suspected he'd been murdered by illegal loggers he was trying to stop." Johnson frowned. "You think he's our Guardian? But that was almost 40 years ago." Rossi nodded. "It's a long shot, but it fits. Blackwood was known for his extreme views on environmental protection. Colleagues described him as brilliant but unstable, convinced that drastic measures were needed to save the forests." I studied the photo, trying to imagine the fresh-faced ranger transformed into the monster we were hunting. If it is him, how has he managed to stay hidden for so long? "That's what we need to find out," Rossi replied. "We're sending a team to Redwood National Park to investigate Blackwood's old stomping grounds. Maybe we'll find something that can lead us to where he is now." A chill ran down my spine. "I'm going with you." Both Johnson and Rossi started to protest, but I held up a hand to stop them. "No, listen. He's fixated on me for a reason. If anyone has a chance of drawing him out, it's me. It's too dangerous, Johnson argued. We can't use you as bait, Clara. I met his gaze, steel in my voice. It's not your decision to make. I'm involved in this whether we like it or not. At least this way, we might have a chance to end it. Rossi studied me for a long moment before nodding slowly. She's right. As much as I hate to admit it, Clara's our best shot at luring the Guardian into the open. The next few days were a blur of preparation. We pored over maps of Redwood National Park, studied Blackwood's old case files, and trained for every contingency we could imagine. As we boarded the plane that would take us to California, I felt a strange mix of fear and determination settling in my gut. Johnson sat beside me, his presence a comforting anchor. "You okay?" he asked softly as the plane began to taxi. I took a deep breath, staring out the window at the receding cityscape. "No," I admitted, "but I will be. Once this is over." Johnson's hand found mine, squeezing gently. "We're going to get through this, Clara. Together." As the plane lifted into the air, carrying us towards a confrontation that had been decades in the making, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were flying into the heart of darkness itself. Hours later, we stood at the edge of Redwood National Park, the ancient trees looming over us like silent sentinels. The air was thick with the scent of pine and damp earth, and the shadows seemed to dance between the massive trunks. Agent Rossi gathered the team around her, her voice low and intense. "Remember, we're here to investigate, not engage. If you see anything suspicious, report it immediately. Do not, under any circumstances, go off alone." As the group dispersed to begin their search, I felt a prickle on the back of my neck. I turned slowly, peering into the dense underbrush. For just a moment, I could have sworn I saw a figure standing there, watching us. But when I blinked, it was gone. "Clara?" Johnson's voice pulled me back to the present. "You ready?" I nodded, forcing my racing heart to calm. "Yeah, let's do this." As we stepped into the forest, the canopy closing over us like a living ceiling, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The Guardian was out there somewhere in this vast wilderness, and soon, one way or another, we would come face to face with the monster who had haunted my nightmares for so long. The hunt had begun, but who was truly the predator, and who was the prey? Only the forest knew, and it kept its secrets held tight in its ancient woody embrace. The dense canopy of the redwoods cast long shadows across the forest floor, creating an eerie twilight even in the middle of the day. Our team had been combing through the park for 3 days, following old trails and searching abandoned ranger stations, but we had found nothing concrete to link Thomas Blackwood to the Guardian. As we set up camp for another night, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every rustle of leaves, every snapping twig, set my nerves on edge. "You're jumping at shadows again," Johnson said softly, settling down beside me near the campfire. I sighed, rubbing my tired eyes. "Can you blame me? We're in his territory now. He could be anywhere." Johnson nodded, his face etched with concern. "I know, but we're all here together. He can't take on an entire FBI team." "Unless that's exactly what he wants," I murmured, staring into the flickering flames. Before Johnson could respond, Agent Rossi approached, her face grim. "We've got a situation," she said in a low voice. "One of our agents hasn't checked in. Greer was supposed to report back an hour ago from the eastern sector." My blood ran cold. "You don't think—" Rossi's jaw tightened. "We can't jump to conclusions, but we need to find him. Now." Within minutes, our camp was a flurry of activity. Teams were assembled, maps consulted, and gear checked. As we prepared to head out into the darkening forest, I felt a familiar dread settling in the pit of my stomach. "Clara," Rossi called, motioning me over. "I want you to stay here with Johnson and a small team. If this is the Guardian, we can't risk you out there." Part of me wanted to protest, to insist on joining the search, but I knew she was right. "Understood," I nodded. As the search parties disappeared into the trees, the remaining few of us huddled around the campfire, tense and watchful. The night seemed to press in around us, the darkness between the trees absolute. Hours passed with no word. The silence was broken only by the crackle of the fire and the occasional hoot of an owl. Then, suddenly, a scream echoed through the forest, distant but unmistakable. We all leapt to our feet, weapons drawn. "That came from the north," Johnson said, his voice tight. Before anyone could stop me, I was moving, racing towards the sound. I heard Johnson curse behind me, then the pounding of feet as he followed. We crashed through the underbrush, branches whipping at our faces. The forest seemed to come alive around us, shadows moving in ways that defied the laws of nature. Suddenly, I burst into a small clearing and skidded to a halt. There in the center stood a figure that could only be the Guardian. He was tall, his body lean and wiry beneath tattered ranger's clothing. A wild beard covered most of his face, but his eyes gleamed with an unnatural light in the darkness. "Clara," he said, his voice a raspy whisper that seemed to come from the trees themselves. "At last, we meet face to face." I raised my gun, trying to steady my shaking hands. "Where's Agent Greer?" I demanded. The Guardian's lips curled into a cruel smile. "The forest has reclaimed him, as it will all who threaten its sanctity." Johnson burst into the clearing behind me, his own weapon trained on the Guardian. "It's over, Blackwood," he growled. "You're surrounded." A low, eerie laugh emanated from the Guardian. "Surrounded? Foolish children. I am the forest, and the forest is me. You cannot hope to contain nature itself." As if in response to his words, the trees around us seemed to groan and shift. Shadows danced at the edges of my vision, taking on monstrous forms. "What do you want?" I asked, fighting to keep my voice steady. The Guardian's eyes locked onto mine, burning with fanatical intensity. "I want you to understand, Clara. To see the truth as I do. The forest chose you, just as it chose me all those years ago. You could be so much more than what you are." I felt a chill run down my spine. "I'm nothing like you," I spat. "No?" he chuckled. "Then why do you hear the whispers of the trees? Why do you feel the pull of the wild in your blood?" Before I could respond, a commotion erupted from the trees. The rest of our team had arrived, surrounding the clearing with shouts and flashlights. The Guardian's face twisted in fury. "This isn't over," he snarled. Then, impossibly, he seemed to melt into the shadows, disappearing before our eyes. As the clearing erupted into chaos, with agents searching frantically for any sign of the Guardian, I stood rooted to the spot. His words echoed in my mind, stirring something deep and primal within me. Johnson's hand on my shoulder snapped me back to reality. "Clara? Are you okay?" I nodded mutely, but I knew it was a lie. Nothing would ever be okay again. The Guardian had escaped, but he had left behind seeds of doubt that were already taking root in my mind. As dawn broke over the forest, casting long shadows through the mist, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of a much darker journey. The Guardian was still out there, waiting. And deep down, in a place I was afraid to acknowledge, part of me was waiting too. The journey back to civilization was a blur of exhaustion and unease. As our convoy of vehicles wound its way out of Redwood National Park, I found myself staring out the window, my mind replaying the encounter with the Guardian over and over. "We'll get him next time," Johnson said softly from the driver's seat, misreading my silence for disappointment. I nodded absently, not trusting myself to speak. How could I explain the turmoil in my mind? The way the Guardian's words had awakened something within me, a connection to the forest I couldn't quite understand or ignore. Back at the local FBI field office, the debriefing was tense. Agent Rossi paced the room, her frustration palpable. "How did he just vanish?" she demanded. "We had the area surrounded." "Ma'am," a young agent spoke up hesitantly. "Some of the team reported unusual occurrences during the search. Shadows moving unnaturally, sounds that couldn't be explained. Rossi's eyes narrowed. Are you suggesting something supernatural? This isn't a ghost story, Agent. Blackwood is flesh and blood, and we will find him. As the debriefing continued, I found myself drifting, the voices around me fading into a distant hum. In my mind, I was back in that clearing, the Guardian's eyes boring into mine. Clara. Johnson's voice snapped me back to reality. The room had emptied. Only he and Rossi remained, both watching me with concern. Sorry, I mumbled, rubbing my temples. I'm just tired. Rossi's expression softened slightly. Go home, get some rest. We'll reconvene in the morning to plan our next move. The drive to my apartment was silent, Johnson casting worried glances my way every few minutes. As we pulled up outside my building, he turned to me. You know you can talk to me, right? About anything. I forced a smile. I know. I'm fine, really. I just need some sleep. But sleep, when it finally came, was far from restful. My dreams were a chaotic swirl of dark forests and whispered promises. I saw myself running through the trees, feeling more alive than I ever had before. The Guardian's voice echoed through my mind. The forest chose you. I woke with a start, my heart racing. Pale morning light filtered through my curtains, and for a moment I could have sworn I smelled pine and damp earth. Shaking off the lingering unease, I showered and dressed, trying to focus on the day ahead. But as I reached for my badge and gun, my hand hesitated. For the first time in my career, I felt a disconnect between who I was and what that badge represented. At the office, the team was already hard at work. New leads were being followed, profiles updated, and search patterns planned. I threw myself into the work, desperate for anything to distract me from the doubts gnawing at my mind. Mid-morning, Rossi called me into her office. We've got something, she said without preamble. A hiker reported seeing a man matching Blackwood's description near Mount Shasta. It's not much, but it's the best lead we've got. I nodded, feeling a mix of anticipation and dread. When do we leave? First thing tomorrow. I want you leading the ground team, Clara. You've had the most direct contact with him. If anyone can anticipate his moves, it's you. As I left Rossi's office, my mind was racing. The thought of facing the Guardian again both terrified and excited me in ways I couldn't explain. You okay? Johnson asked, falling into step beside me. You've been quiet all day. I paused, considering my words carefully. Do you ever wonder if we're on the right side of this? Johnson's brow furrowed. What do you mean? I struggled to articulate the thoughts that had been plaguing me. Blackwood, the Guardian, whatever we call him. He's a killer, yes. But what if he's right about the forests? About the need to protect them at any cost? Clara, Johnson said, his voice low and urgent. Listen to yourself. He's manipulating you, getting in your head. Don't let him. I shook my head, frustrated. You weren't there in that clearing. You didn't feel what I felt. There's something more going on here, something we don't understand. Johnson gripped my shoulders, forcing me to meet his gaze. I know you, Clara. You're a good person, a good cop. Don't let this case make you question that. I wanted to believe him, to shake off the doubts that had taken root in my mind, but as I looked into his concerned eyes, I realized that a part of me had already changed. The forest had called to something deep within me, and I wasn't sure I could ignore it any longer. As the day wore on and preparations for the Mount Shasta expedition continued, I found myself torn between two worlds. The familiar world of law and order, represented by my badge and my colleagues, and the wild, unknowable world the Guardian had shown me a glimpse of. Tomorrow, we would head into the wilderness once more. And this time I knew the true battle wouldn't just be against the Guardian, it would be against the growing whispers in my own heart, urging me towards a path I both feared and longed to explore. The early morning mist clung to the slopes of Mount Shasta as our team began our ascent. The air was crisp and thin, filled with the scent of pine and the promise of snow. I led the way, my senses on high alert, every rustle and snap drawing my attention. "Stay close," I called back to the team. "The Guardian knows this terrain better than we do." We had been climbing for hours when Johnson caught up to me, his breath coming in short puffs. "Clara," he said quietly, "are you sure you're up for this? After everything that happened in Redwood?" I cut him off with a sharp look. "I'm fine. I need to see this through." But even as I said the words, doubt gnawed at me. The truth was, I didn't know if I was pursuing the Guardian to capture him or to understand him. As we reached a small plateau, I called for a brief rest. The team spread out, checking equipment and sipping from water bottles. I walked to the edge of the clearing, staring out at the vast expanse of wilderness before us. Suddenly, a flash of movement caught my eye. Without thinking, I plunged into the underbrush, ignoring Johnson's startled shout behind me. I crashed through the forest, branches whipping at my face. The world narrowed to the figure always just out of reach, leading me deeper into the wild. Finally, I burst into a small clearing and skidded to a halt. There, standing at the edge of a cliff, was the Guardian. "You came," he said, his voice carrying on the wind. "I knew you would." I raised my gun, but my hand was shaking. "It's over, Blackwood. There's nowhere left to run." He turned to face me, and I was struck by the fierce intensity in his eyes. "Run? Oh, Clara, I'm not running. I'm exactly where I need to be, where we both need to be." "What are you talking about?" I demanded, trying to ignore the way his words resonated within me. The Guardian spread his arms wide, encompassing the wilderness around us. "Can't you feel it? The pulse of the earth, the whispers of the trees? This is where we belong, Clara. Not in their world of concrete and rules, but here, in the heart of nature." I shook my head, fighting against the pull of his words. "You're a killer. You've taken innocent lives." "Innocent?" he scoffed. "They were destroying the forest, Clara, piece by piece, year after year. I did what had to be done to protect it." "That's not your decision to make," I shouted. But even as the words left my mouth, I felt a flicker of doubt. The Guardian's eyes softened, and he took a step towards me. "It's not just my decision anymore. It's ours. The forest chose you, just as it chose me. You feel it, don't you? The connection, the calling?" I swallowed hard, unable to deny the truth in his words. Ever since our encounter in Redwood, I had felt different, more alive, more in tune with the natural world around me. "It doesn't have to be this way," I said, lowering my gun slightly. "We can find another way to protect the forests, one that doesn't involve killing." The Guardian shook his head sadly. "Oh, Clara, if only it were that simple. But the world isn't ready to listen. Not yet. That's why we must become the voice of the wilderness, its guardians and avengers." I heard shouts in the distance. The rest of the team was catching up. The Guardian tensed, ready to flee. "Wait," I called out, surprising myself. I need to understand. Show me what you see." For a moment, the Guardian studied me intently. Then, slowly, he extended his hand. "Come with me, Clara. Let me show you the truth." Time seemed to stand still as I stood there, poised on the edge of a decision that would change everything. The shouts were getting closer. The team would be here any second. In that moment, I saw two paths stretched out before me. One led back to the world I knew, to law and order, and the comfort of certainty. The other led into the wild unknown, guided by a man the world called a monster, but who spoke to something primal within me. As Johnson's voice called out my name, panic evident in his tone, I made my choice. I reached out and took the Guardian's hand. The world seemed to shift around us. The forest came alive in ways I had never experienced before. Colors were brighter, scents more intense. I could feel the pulse of life in every tree, every blade of grass. "This is just the beginning," the Guardian whispered, his eyes alight with an almost supernatural glow. "There is so much more to learn, to become, As we melted into the shadows of the forest, leaving behind the shouts and chaos of my old life, I felt a mix of exhilaration and terror. I didn't know where this path would lead, or what I would become at the end of it. But as the wilderness embraced us, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. There was no going back. The forest had called, and I had answered. Whatever came next, I would face it as a guardian of the wild, for better or for worse. The trees closed in around us, and the world I had known faded away like a half-remembered dream. Ahead lay a future both terrifying and thrilling, filled with secrets of nature and the darkness that dwelled in the hearts of its protectors. My transformation had begun. The forest pulsed with life around me as I followed the guardian deeper into its heart. Days blurred into nights, and I lost all sense of time. My old life felt like a distant memory, replaced by the raw, primal existence of the wilderness. "You're adapting well," the guardian observed one evening as we sat by a small fire. His weathered face was illuminated by the flickering flames, his eyes reflecting an otherworldly knowledge. I nodded, still struggling to articulate the changes I felt within myself. "It's overwhelming. I can feel everything. The trees, the earth, even the air. It's like I've been blind my whole life, and now I can finally see." He smiled, a rare expression that transformed his stern features. "That's the forest speaking to you, Clara. You're beginning to understand its language." As the days passed, the guardian, Thomas, as I'd come to know him, taught me the secrets of the wild. He showed me how to move silently through the underbrush, how to read the signs left by animals and the whispers of the wind. But it wasn't all beauty and wonder. There was a darkness to our path, a ruthlessness that both terrified and exhilarated me. One morning we came across a group of loggers preparing to cut down an ancient grove. The rage that filled me was unlike anything I'd ever experienced before. "We can't let them do this," I hissed, my hand instinctively reaching for the knife at my belt. Thomas placed a restraining hand on my arm. "Patience, Clara. Violence is a last resort. First, we try other means." Over the next few days, we sabotaged equipment, created false trails, and used every non-violent method at our disposal to disrupt the logging operation. But the company was persistent, bringing in more workers and machines. Finally, as we watched a magnificent old-growth tree crash to the ground, Thomas turned to me with a grim expression. "Now, Clara, now we show them the true cost of their actions." What followed was a night of terror for the logging camp. We moved like shadows, striking fear into the hearts of those who would harm the forest. By dawn, the camp was abandoned, the workers fleeing with tales of forest spirits and vengeful ghosts. As we stood amidst the empty camp, I felt a mixture of triumph and horror at what we'd done. "Is this who we are now?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Thomas's eyes met mine, filled with a fierce intensity. "We are whatever the forest needs us to be. Protectors, avengers, forces of nature itself." Weeks turned into months, and I found myself fully embracing this new life. My old self, Detective Clara Whelan, felt like a character in a half-forgotten story. Now, I was simply Clara of the forest, guardian and protector. But my past wasn't content to let me go so easily. One crisp autumn morning, as we were tracking a group of poachers, a familiar voice cut through the forest stillness. "Clara, Clara, are you out there?" I froze, my heart pounding. It was Johnson. Thomas melted into the shadows, leaving me to face this ghost from my past alone. Johnson emerged from the trees, his face a mixture of relief and disbelief as he saw me. "Clara? My God, it is you. We've been searching for months. What happened to you?" I stood my ground, feeling the forest's strength flow through me. "I found my true path, Johnson. I'm where I belong now." He took a step closer, his eyes scanning my wild appearance, the leather clothing, the knife at my belt, the fierce gleam in my eyes. "This isn't you, Clara. Blackwoods manipulated you, twisted your mind. Come back with me. We can get you help. For a moment, I felt a flicker of doubt. Memories of my old life, the camaraderie, the sense of purpose, the clear line between right and wrong, washed over me. But then I felt it. The pulse of the forest, the whisper of the trees. This was my home now, my purpose. "I'm sorry, Johnson," I said, my voice steady, "but I can't go back. This is who I am now." His face fell, a mix of sadness and determination settling over his features. "I can't let you do this, Clara. You're coming with me, even if I have to drag you out of here." As he reached for his handcuffs, I felt Thomas's presence behind me, a silent reminder of the choice I'd made. "Don't make me do this, Johnson," I warned, shifting into a defensive stance. What followed was a brutal, desperate struggle. Johnson's training was impeccable, but I had the strength of the forest flowing through me. We crashed through the underbrush, each trying to subdue the other without causing serious harm. Finally, I managed to pin Johnson against a tree, my forearm pressed against his throat. "Stop fighting," I growled. "I don't want to hurt you." Johnson's eyes met mine, filled with a mix of fear and sorrow. "What happened to you, Clara? What did he do to you?" I eased the pressure on his throat but didn't release him. "He opened my eyes, Johnson. Showed me the truth about the world, about myself. I'm not the person you knew anymore." As I spoke, I felt Thomas approach, his presence a palpable force. Johnson's eyes widened as he saw the Guardian emerge from the shadows. "You have a choice to make, old friend," I said softly. "Walk away and forget you ever saw us, or join us and learn the truth for yourself." Johnson's gaze darted between Thomas and me, confusion and conflict clear on his face. I can't just let you go, Clara. You know that." Thomas spoke then, his voice carrying the weight of ancient wisdom. "The forest has chosen her as it chose me. Fighting against that will only bring more pain, more destruction. Let her go, and perhaps one day you'll understand." I released Johnson, stepping back to stand beside Thomas. For a long moment, Johnson stood there, his world visibly crumbling around him. Finally, he slumped in defeat. "I don't understand any of this," he said, his voice breaking. "But I can't bring you in, Clara. Not like this, just be careful. And if you ever want to come back..." I nodded, feeling a mix of relief and sadness. "Thank you, Johnson, for everything." As Johnson disappeared into the forest, heading back to the world I'd left behind, I turned to Thomas. "What now?" I asked. He smiled, a fierce, wild expression that set my heart racing. "Now we continue our work. The forest needs its guardians more than ever." Hand in hand, we melted into the shadows of our woodland domain, leaving the last vestiges of my old life behind. The path ahead was uncertain, filled with danger and difficult choices. But as I felt the forest's energy coursing through me, I knew I was exactly where I was meant to be. The true test of my commitment to this new life was yet to come. But I was ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead, as a true guardian of the will. Seasons changed, and I changed with them. My connection to the forest grew deeper, more visceral. Thomas and I moved like wraiths through the wilderness, protecting our domain with a ferocity that both thrilled and terrified me. One crisp autumn morning, as mist clung to the treetops, Thomas and I crouched at the edge of a clearing. A group of developers had set up camp, their heavy machinery poised to tear into the heart of an ancient grove. "They never learn," Thomas growled, his eyes flashing with barely contained rage. I placed a hand on his arm, feeling the tension in his muscles. "We'll stop them," I assured him. "We always do." But as we watched the workers begin their day, a commotion at the edge of the camp caught our attention. A familiar figure strode into view, flanked by FBI agents. "Johnson," I whispered, my heart rate quickening. Thomas's eyes narrowed. "He's persistent, I'll give him that." We listened intently as Johnson addressed the camp supervisor. We have reason to believe that two dangerous individuals may be operating in this area, Johnson explained, his voice carrying to our hidden position. Thomas Blackwood and Clara Whelan. They're considered armed and extremely dangerous. The supervisor scoffed. Look, Agent, we've heard the stories. Forest spirits and eco-terrorists. It's all nonsense meant to scare us off. We have a job to do here. Johnson's face hardened. This is not a joke, sir. These individuals have been linked to numerous acts of sabotage and violence across several states. If you spot them, do not approach. Contact us immediately. As the FBI team began to set up surveillance equipment around the perimeter of the camp, Thomas and I retreated deeper into the forest. This complicates things, I murmured, my mind racing with the implications. Thomas nodded grimly. They're closing in. We need to be more careful than ever. Over the next few days, we watched and waited, looking for an opportunity to disrupt the development without alerting the FBI to our presence. But Johnson's team was thorough, their surveillance net tightening around the area. On the third night, as we huddled in a hidden cave, Thomas turned to me with a serious expression. Clara, we need to talk about what happens if we're caught. I felt a chill run down my spine. What do you mean? He took my hands in his calloused fingers rough against my skin. You still have a chance at a normal life. If things go wrong, if they close in on us, I want you to turn yourself in. Tell them I manipulated you, forced you to help me. They'll believe it. I jerked away from him, anger flaring in my chest. No, I won't abandon you, Thomas. We're in this together. His eyes softened, a mix of pride and sorrow in their depths. You've come so far, Clara. You're a true guardian now. But you're young, you have a future. I've lived my life, made my choices. I can't ask you to sacrifice everything for this cause. Tears stung my eyes as I gripped his shoulders fiercely. You didn't ask me to do anything. I chose this path just as you did. Whatever comes, we face it together. Before he could respond, a sound outside our cave made us both freeze. Voices moving closer. In here, I saw movement. We sprang into action, grabbing our meager supplies and slipping out through a hidden back entrance. But as we emerged into the moonlit forest, we found ourselves surrounded. FBI agents materialized from behind trees, weapons trained on us. And there, at the forefront, stood Johnson. It's over, he called out, his voice a mix of relief and regret. Please, don't make this any harder than it has to be. I felt Thomas tense beside me, ready to fight or flee. But in that moment, looking at the ring of agents around us, I knew our time in the wilderness had come to an end. Thomas, I whispered, squeezing his hand, we can't outrun them. Not this time. His eyes met mine, a lifetime of defiance and passion burning within them. Then, slowly, he nodded. We surrender, I called out, raising my hands. We're unarmed. As the agents moved in to apprehend us, Johnson approached, his face a mask of conflicting emotions. Clara, he said softly, I'm glad you're alive. I'm sorry it had to end this way. I met his gaze steadily. Don't be sorry, Johnson. I'm not. Every choice I made freely. As they led us away in handcuffs, I took one last look at the forest that had been our home. The trees seemed to whisper in the night breeze, a farewell and a promise. Our time as free guardians of the wild might be over, but our fight was far from finished. In the coming days, we would face interrogations, trials, and the judgment of a world that couldn't understand our actions. But as I felt the pulse of the earth beneath my feet, the whisper of the wind in my ears, I knew that no prison could truly contain what we had become. The spirit of the forest lived within us now, and one day somehow we would find a way to continue our mission. The guardian and his apprentice might be captured, but the forest would never truly lose its protectors. Our story, I realized, was far from over. It was merely entering a new chapter, one that would test our resolve and our connection to the wild in ways we had never imagined. As we were led away from our woodland sanctuary, I held my head high. Whatever trials lay ahead, I would face them with the strength of the forest in my heart and the certainty that our cause was just. The battle for the soul of the wilderness had only just begun,